Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new session of TRT World Forum's digital debates. I am Elif Zaim, and today we're going to discuss tensions in Bosnia. Is there a new conflict on the horizon? Bosnia Herzegovina is going through its greatest crisis since the end of the war in 1995. On December 2021, Bosnian Serb politicians voted to withdraw from the state-level institutions, including security services, tax system, and judiciary, as well as to establish an independent army. While all of these provisions are in direct violation of the Dayton Peace Accords, which officially ended the Bosnian War, they threaten not only the country's sovereignty but also regional stability. Bosnia's High Representative, Christian Schmitt, who is tasked with ensuring the implementation of Dayton Agreement, warned that the move is, and I quote, tantamount to secession without proclaiming it. The Assembly of Republika Srpska tasked the entity-level government with drafting a new legislation to achieve the proposed measures within 6 months. Since this is not the first time in which Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb member of the country's tripartite presidency, has raised the specter of separatism, questions remain as to whether the upcoming period should be regarded as a time of bargaining to carve out concessions meant to serve his agenda, or the prelude to an effective secession, sparking a new conflict that would have implications beyond Bosnia's borders. To discuss this very important topic, I'm delighted to be joined by an amazing panel of speakers. Ms. Nafisa Latic, a journalist and presenter of TRT roles across the Balkans program, Dr. Hikmet Karcic, genocide scholar, and Dr. Marco Attila Hoare, associate professor and head of research for the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. Welcome to all. It's great to have you on the program today. So without any further overdue, I would like to pose my first question to Hikmet. As I already mentioned in the introduction, this is not the first time that Mr. Dodik has raised the specter of potential secession of Republika Srpska. And there are various arguments being made about the timing of this crisis. Some say that Mr. Dodik is trying to gather support because his popularity is declining. Some are saying that he is trying to extract some concessions, whereas others are arguing that he's seizing the moment and testing the waters to see the international and local reactions to the prospect of secession. So what do you think? What is Mr. Dodik's game plan?
Thank you, Elif. Well, first of all, I just want to underline that when the Bosnian Serb Republic is in question, the future of the Bosnian Serb Republic is, and the game plan for the Bosnian Serb Republic among all politicians, among all Bosnian Serb politicians, is basically the same. So there is no opposition inside the Bosnian Serb Republic for secession, for independence. Basically, the only existing opposition in the Bosnian Serb Republic only opposes the methods which Dodik uses. So in the end, the end game is basically the same for the whole entire Bosnian Serb establishment, just like it was in 1992. Only the methods or the ways in how to achieve all of this differs. In my concrete opinion, I believe that Milorad Dodik plans to use the 30th anniversary of Republika Srpska, which they celebrated a few days ago, in order to proclaim independence in the next couple of months. He, of course, would not be doing this if he had not had the support from two major countries, from Serbia and from Russia. Let's not forget that the main pushing force which came from Dodik came after a meeting that was held in Belgrade during the Non-Aligned Movement conference, and the meeting was between Vučić, Lavrov, and Dodik. So after this meeting, this is when Dodik started going in a much more radicalized way. So I'm pretty sure that with the Ukrainian conflict on the borders of Europe, so on the gates of Europe, Dodik is going to use this in order to proclaim independence and to get a very cheap way out of this whole entire situation currently.
And Nafisa, so Mr. Dodik's political party, the SNSD, has been winning elections and gaining majority of the votes of Bosnian Serb electorate in Republika Srpska, and Hikmet already mentioned that his popularity in with regards to the secession. So since we are in the run up to the elections, which will be held this year in October, do you think? I mean, like Bosnian Serbs, they may be supporting the secession, but do you think they would be voting for him, or is there a viable opposition who disagrees with him? Nafisa, your microphone is muted.
Yes. I still think it's too early to say what will opposition in Republika Srpska do, but they, as Hikmet just mentioned, they already rejected proposition that Mr. Dodik had in National Assembly a couple of weeks ago, and they clearly stated that they disagree with the means and the path that he's taking in the recent couple of weeks and months. They were very clear, especially in saying that his rhetoric is leading to divisions and to war. So let's see how will they play in the next couple of months, because I think the Dodik's positions is very different now than in the past elections when he won a majority of elections. He already lost the support in National Assembly, so definitely his position is different. But I do agree with Hikmet. He feels emboldened. He feels that he does have more support, maybe not in his own entity that he represents, but from outside. And he's trying to portray himself one more time among Bosnian Serbs as this hero who is defending the entity until the end. He is trying to, as media in Republika Srpska portray it, he is returning their own competencies from the state to entity. That's something that a lot of people, unfortunately, in Republika Srpska feel that's their right to have one day. So I do believe that this kind of rhetoric will gain him more support among majority of Bosnian Serbs, but the opposition last time wasn't that strong like this time. And I think having in mind how international community also imposed, especially the US, the sanctions on Dodik. Let's see how will they play out. But I think it's still too early to talk about the opposition in Republika Srpska. I'm not sure which path they will take. I think it was good that for the first time we've seen Dodik trying to put something in the parliament and having very, very strong response. We haven't seen that before, especially when he wanted to veto. First time the veto was rejected. So let's see what happens with the opposition.
So Marco, both Nafisa and Hikmet already mentioned about the what's happening, like in terms of the international reactions to Dodik's statements and policies. And the US is one of the key players, and the country has sanctioned Mr. Dodik for his corrupt activities and continued threats to the stability and territorial integrity of Bosnia. So in addition to that, today, the administrator Samantha Power is arriving to the country. So do you think will these efforts be enough to diffuse tensions? If not, what other ways can the US play a constructive role?
Well, it's certainly a start. I mean, certainly sanctioning Dodik is part of any solution. He has to experience some kind of coercion or pressure to make him change his policies. But I think he reasonably feels that he doesn't have anything to fear, because this US administration hasn't shown itself to be very, very tough. I mean, Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. He's not really confronting the Russians in Ukraine. So Dodik probably feels that he can weather the storm. But that said, the problem isn't simply the lack of resolve on the part of the US leadership. The problem is that Dodik is ultimately a symptom of the problem. He didn't create the problem. The problem is the Dayton system. So this system that was put in place in 1995, when there was a negotiated end to the peace, essentially entrenches ethnic division and encourages ethnic conflict, if you want to put it in those terms, and particularly encourages Serb separatism. So by legitimizing this entity created by genocide, the Republika Srpska, it's created an entity which has a kind of structural reasons and ideological basis to wanting to secede from Bosnia. And as long as that entity exists, we're going to have more Dodiks after the present one. So Dodik himself began as a moderate, and then when he became kind of the top person in Republika Srpska, then the system kind of turned him into a separatist. So to try and resolve the problem properly, what you need is a radical constitutional reform. So to change the system to either abolish Republika Srpska altogether, or at very least reduce its competencies greatly to restore a functioning central Bosnian authority. And unless the United States does that, or the United States and the West sets that in motion, nothing is going to get better in the long term. And as things stand, it doesn't look like the United States has the appetite to do that.
So Hikmet, I'll come back to the criticisms about Dayton Agreement, but I want to continue on this. Like, what about the European countries? Their reactions have been mixed. While states such as Germany and Sweden have been discussing sanctions, far-right leaders such as Hungary's Viktor Orban have offered support to Mr. Dodik. Can you elaborate on these dynamics and what sort of an impact do they have on the crisis?
Yeah, so basically, in the last couple of years, the Bosnian Serb Republic has become a playground for far-right nativist and populist leaders and organizations, not only from Europe, but also in a very transatlantic sphere. So we had, for example, Željko Cvijanović, who was the Prime Minister of Republika Srpska, meeting up with Steve Bannon a few years ago. Then, having different far-right politicians from Austria, Germany, Italy, coming and visiting Milorad Dodik and Republika Srpska. A few days ago, we had members of Le Pen's party from France attending the 9th January celebrations. So basically, what we see here is that Milorad Dodik and the whole entire Bosnian Serb establishment plays very well with the fears of the West by claiming that Bosniaks here are some sort of demographic bomb and a threat to Europe, and as such that he's trying to find some sort of legitimacy in order to move away from the country, or even to get some sort of legitimacy for any potential violence in the future. In September last year, there was a huge meeting in Budapest called the European Demographic Summit, in which the main actors were Orban, Vučić, Dodik, and Mike Pence from the United States, where the main topic was the rise of Muslim demographics, the rise of Muslim populations in Europe. And Dodik basically categorized the whole entire Bosniak population in Bosnia as a security threat. And that is something which we find to be very problematic, and something which directly threatens the biological existence of Bosniaks in Bosnia. And what is also very interesting, which I think your viewers need to know, is that in the last couple of months, Dodik has entirely stopped calling Bosniaks as Bosniaks, but started to refer to them as Muslims. So it's say, Muslims are a majority in Bosnia. They have a Muslim majority army, Muslim police force. Trying to use this term more and more so that this kind of terminology can get to attract as many far-right leaders from Europe as possible. And Orban is definitely one of the people who not only supports him politically but also financially. The Orban sent over $100 million to Dodik financially to support him for any of the future causes. So definitely, I think that we are at this moment very deep in a huge political and security crisis from which it's going to be very, very complicated and complex in the next couple of weeks and months.
So, Marco, besides this far-right support to Milorad Dodik, Russia is also supporting Mr. Dodik. And Russia has been making headlines recently with what's happening in Ukraine. And it is certainly a key player that is being discussed a lot when it comes to the Balkans in general and Bosnia in particular. Can you tell us what are Russia's goals in the country, how Russia tries to achieve this, and how do these efforts link to Russian foreign policy in the wider region?
Right, so Russia is a revisionist power. Putin is a revanchist. He wants essentially to avenge himself against the West for Russia's defeat in the Cold War, for the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to restore Russia as a great power. And to do this, he wants to disrupt the expansion of Euro-Atlantic institutions into and across Europe, particularly in the Balkans. And he wants to carve out his own sphere of influence for Russia as a power. So there's a whole pattern of things he's doing. I mean, he's not just doing this in the Balkans. He destabilizes. He's attacking Ukraine. He attacked Georgia. He launched cyber attacks against the Baltic states. But in the Balkans, he also is trying to essentially prevent NATO and the EU from expanding, particularly NATO. So he is trying to keep the regional conflicts unresolved. So, for example, he's supporting Serbia strongly on the issue of Kosovo's independence to prevent Kosovo becoming a recognized member of the international community, and that keeps that conflict alive. He has been destabilized Macedonia. So when Macedonia had its sort of pro-Western leadership, he was trying to destabilize it by supporting the kind of nationalist populist opposition, destabilizing Montenegro, supporting the Serb nationalists there, and destabilizing Bosnia Herzegovina is part of this. So obviously, if Bosnia Herzegovina collapses into war, or if Republika Srpska secedes, it'll be that much harder for Bosnia as a country to join either the European Union or NATO. And if Republika Srpska were to emerge as a kind of rogue state like Transnistria, for example, it would be much harder then for Bosnia to join those institutions, but also Russians would have their own base in the region. So they'd have a little satellite state which would be entirely dependent upon it. So is this a policy of carving out a new Russian sphere and preventing the sort of region's inclusion in Euro-Atlantic institutions?
And Nafisa, speaking of Russia, over a month ago, Mr. Dodik was there and he was received by the Russian president, Mr. Putin. So I know that you follow him and the Balkan politics closely. So if you compare the speeches given by Mr. Dodik outside and inside of Bosnia, is there a change in his rhetoric catered to his audience?
There is a constant change in his rhetoric. Firstly, inside the country, I remember when Mr. Dodik just became a player in the political playground of Bosnia, when he just started to become someone who matters in his entity. He wasn't seen like a divisive figure because his rhetoric was completely different. Let's not forget that Milorad Dodik is the first Bosnian Serb who actually himself described the atrocities in Srebrenica genocide. Remember that famous interview he gave to one Bosnian journalist in 2008, and he called Srebrenica genocide then. So his rhetoric completely changed from then to now, and how we call him a politician that wants to break his own country apart. So his rhetoric changes constantly. What I've noticed also when he is traveling abroad, especially when he comes here in Turkey, his rhetoric is very different, much milder. In an interview that he gave for us a couple of months ago, just before the start of this crisis, just before former High Representative Inzko imposed the law, which, as you know, started this biggest crisis when the Bosnian Serbs started boycotting the institutions. So a couple of weeks before, he gave an interview to us, and he said the peace is the most important word in the Balkans. To be honest, to me as a Bosniak, I was shocked with his rhetoric given to Turkish media, international media, and he was always calling for dialogue. So when it comes to Dodik, I think he changes his rhetoric when depending on the political circumstances and the support that he gets. And as Marco and Hikmet both mentioned, lately he is gaining so much support. He feels so emboldened. Last time, even in his speech while celebrating the Independence Day of Republika Srpska, he openly said that the United Kingdom, the US and the EU are working against his people and Republika Srpska. It felt like his rhetoric was stronger than I've ever seen before. Openly accusing very strong international actors in Bosnia, which may come to conclusion, as Marco said, that even the US sanctions and the EU's positions lately didn't work when it comes to Dodik, and I feel things will get worse. At least that's how I can read into his speeches and his rhetoric. So definitely very different while speaking in Banja Luka, when speaking in Ankara like a couple of months ago, and definitely in Russia where he goes often, or Belgrade. His rhetoric keep changing, but lately definitely he feels much stronger than ever.
So Marco, you mentioned loads of criticisms about the Dayton Peace Agreement, and if we continue to talk about this, we definitely have to touch upon an important institution, the Office of High Representative, OHR. And Mr. Dodik has stated that he no longer respects the decisions taken by the High Representative, and that the office should be abolished altogether. So what is the reasoning behind these statements? And can you tell us about, a little bit about the powers of the High Representative, and how do other constituent peoples of the country, namely Croats and Bosniaks, view OHR, and what sort of a role does this institution play today in comparison to when it was, first founded, or when it was playing a more active role?
So historically, the Office of the High Representative was an institution that acted to strengthen Bosnian statehood, and the High Representative had these powers called the bond powers, which could be used to discipline local politicians who were behaving badly, so in particular Serb and Croat separatists. So at the height of its power, the High Representative actually used these powers to remove people as senior as Republika Srpska presidents. So Nikola Poplašin, who was a hardline president of Republika Srpska, was actually removed by the bond powers. So it was acting historically as an institution that bolstered Bosnian statehood and unity and punished these troublemakers. Now that was at the height of its powers, and since then it's declined. So since about the last 15 years or so, the institution has greatly declined in power, and this has been linked in part to the reduction of the international troop presence in Bosnia, and also to the wish of the international community, to the Western powers, to try and devolve power back to the local actors, to try and make Bosnians take responsibility for governing themselves. But without this OHR, then there's much less of a restraint on people like Dodik pursuing their separatist policies. So it's really more like a kind of lingering obstacle, which perhaps was not as much an obstacle to his ambitions as it would have been 15 years ago, but which nevertheless could potentially become again. So you have supporters of Bosnia Herzegovina, particularly Bosniaks, sometimes supporting a stronger OHR to try and restore its power, to try and act against Dodik and other troublemakers, for example, in the HDZ. You also have this the previous incumbent passing a law against genocide denial just before leaving office, and Dodik is someone who promotes Srebrenica genocide denial and uses it as part of his ideology to try and stir up nationalism. So that was a kind of a direct, if you like, a direct challenge to him. So for all these reasons, Dodik resents the OHR and sees it as an obstacle to his separatist ambitions. That said, it's probably not as important as it once would have been. So if it stays or if it goes, unless it's greatly strengthened, it won't prove much of an obstacle. But nevertheless, it is a target for him as part of his long, patient campaign to bring about Republika Srpska's independence.
To add up to that, I mean, it doesn't seem that having a high representative in the country is sustainable, but without a high representative, we have nationalist politicians like secession, and so, I mean, what would be a solution to this?
Well, so either you, there's two possibilities. To keep Bosnia from splitting apart, you either have to have very strong international presence through the OHR or some other similar institution, backed up by strong troop presence, to try and force the country essentially to stay together, to force politicians like Dodik, Dragan Čović, and others to respect the situation, essentially curse the country to stay together. That's necessary so long as the existing constitutional structure exists, because the existing constitutional structure will empower separatism. So if you want Bosnia to remain stable and united as a country without this massive international presence, which is what the ideal would be. I mean, it's not healthy for any country to depend upon this national occupation indefinitely. You need to change the constitution to enable the central state authority to maintain order. So, for example, in the United States, you have a devolved power. You have states, and you have a lot of power for local mayors and so forth. But nevertheless, you have a strong president, strong Congress, central institutions just have a lot of power. So you could do this in Bosnia too. Have a country that a constitutional arrangement that actually enables the central government to function, but nevertheless perhaps devolves powers to the regions. But as long as Bosnia retains its existing constitutional structure, then you will need an strong international presence to prevent the country from breaking up.
I mean, constitution is part of the peace agreement, so it would be hard to change it, I suppose. But Hikmet, so we already talked about Nafisa's exclusive interview with Mr. Dodik a couple of months ago for TRT Roles Across the Balkans program. So during this interview, he had an interesting statement. He said, Bosniaks do not have an adequate political elite who can reflect the interests of the people. So what is your take on Mr. Dodik's statements? And given this crisis situation, do you think Bosniak leaders have the means and the roadmap to deal with this, or are they relying primarily on the international community to prevent secession?
Okay. So first of all, the Bosnian Serb Republic and Dodik alike, they also don't have a Bosnian Serb political elite, and they also don't know what they exactly want, because they usually get the instructions from Belgrade or from Moscow. So just to clear that up. On the other hand, Bosniak politicians are very naive. I must say that they don't have a clear path. They don't know what exactly to do, and they do mainly focus on what the West is going to do. They believe that they don't have to, move a finger regarding this whole entire crisis, because the truth is on our side and the law is on our side. Thus, nothing bad can happen to us. But the people of Bosnia have learned that lesson, 30 years ago, and they know that nobody's going to come and sort your problems out. And we at this time need to pick our battles. We need to know who is our ally, and we need to search for our allies. And at this concrete moment, I think that we and Bosniak political elites as well at this current stage, they have they finally come to the realization of who our allies are, and hopefully we'll be going in that direction more in the future.
And you mentioned that different ethnic groups rely on different countries. So we talked about the situation of Serbs, but what about Croats? How do they see this whole crisis, like secession, and how does Croatia act? What role does it play in this?
In the last couple of years, it has started to go to a very negative context, and more recently, a high-ranking Croat politician who visited Srebrenica on several occasions started to deny Srebrenica genocide, because it seems that denying a genocide is somehow very in and very cool these days. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, we have Dragan Čović, the Bosnian Croat leader, along with some other members of the Croatian political elite, who are siding with the Russians right now in a very long way. And something similar to Orban's playbook, they are siding with both sides, basically trying to be on the winning side in the end. So that is what I meant when I said earlier that we have to pick our battles, because we actually between Serbia and Croatia, we as Bosniaks in Bosnia, we need to decide who our ally is going to be, because we won't be able to fight two fronts at one point. And if it continues in this direction, I'm pretty sure that we're going to have another 1993 scenario again, and that's something which I and many other people are quite afraid of.
Yeah, if I may jump in here, Elif, briefly,
Sure,
when it comes to Bosniaks, I just feel that most of the people have lost trust in the US and in the EU, because all that they're hearing and seeing is these statements that are constantly the same. So no matter what Dodik does, the statement comes out of how they condemn or they expect him to obey or to respect the sovereignty of the country. So what the Bosnia completely lost is this trust that someone's going to come in and do an actual concrete step to prevent further divisions, which could lead, I agree with Hikmet, to scenarios we've seen in the 90s. And that's something I'm sure even Mr. Dodik doesn't want to see. But with this kind of rhetoric, people are being heated up. We've seen scenes, again, around 9th of January. Marco and me discussed that in Across the Balkans too. Across Bosnia, Bosniaks being attacked, the mosques being attacked. People once again on the streets fighting around something that should have been solved long time ago. So we are seeing the same divisions as we've seen at the beginning of the war. So what Bosniaks and I believe other ethnic groups too they need to see some kind of concrete step towards Mr. Dodik to make sure that Bosnian sovereignty is not taken. Unfortunately, with all these visits, I haven't seen the plan or what to do, what's coming up next. All I can see is just the same statements. So I believe most of the Bosniaks feel the same as me. Even as a journalist, you are in some way even bored with asking the same questions. Will the EU do something? Will the EU have a unified approach to the crisis in Bosnia? But that is actually the only question that you can ask any analyst or any politician currently in Bosnia. What can we expect from them? And unfortunately, with Merkel leaving, we don't have this unified approach. Marco and Hikmet both mentioned that briefly, but we don't have a unified approach to the Balkans. And we've seen with Ukraine to other parts of Europe too. So I'm afraid that something needs to be done. And I'm not sure that anyone has a plan. And I hope that we will not see even bigger crisis, as Hikmet was mentioning.
Yeah, hopefully
that's the atmosphere, the current atmosphere in Bosnia.
And hopefully we don't see anything as like this again. So as a journalist, I wanted to ask you, can you talk us about the media landscape in Bosnia? How does this recent crisis is covered by media outlets, both in Republika Srpska and Federation?
Where again, very different narratives. In Federation, we've seen, titles on the websites like "The War is Starting," which people made even more anxious and scared. In Republika Srpska, completely different narrative. We are returning our competencies from state to entity. It's time for change. Depending, the media is very divided in Bosnia. So depending, are they entity media or Federation media? So it's not helping with the rhetoric. Especially, we've seen recently a rise of genocide denial across the media in Republika Srpska. The narrative that is pretty much the same, but now again with Dodik's moves even more emboldened. So it's not helping. And in general, even international media, they are lately covering Bosnia just because they heard it's the biggest crisis in the region. I remember we've all discussed this topic a couple of times, and no one believed me that it's so serious until the new High Representative gave an interview to Guardian and said this is the biggest crisis. Then suddenly it was all over international media. So I always say this when people ask me. I do think that in general, international media needs to pay more attention to Bosnia at this particular moment. And to try to explain what again is happening there, because having just titles is Bosnia at the brink of the war. I'm not sure it's enough explanation to someone who didn't follow what was going on in the Balkans as of recently. But I think media needs to have a little bit more responsible role, especially the one in the Balkans. But in this particular scenario, even I started my show with Bosnia is facing the worst political crisis ever, because it is, and this is the time when we need to call it like that. So yeah, we need to pick our battles. I agree with Hikmet, and this is one of the most serious battles that we have to fight at this moment when it comes to sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And so we already said that this is the biggest crisis since the war, but Marco, secession is one of country's problems, and we have another problem, another contested topic, which is the proposed reforms and the electoral system. So nationalist leaders like Croat Dragan Čović and Mr. Dodik have repeatedly stated that their parties are going to boycott the upcoming elections if no electoral reform takes place. But this seems almost like a mission impossible, given the divergent views of local, regional, international actors. Can you tell us what is the importance of this electoral reform? I mean, it is linked to this ethnic quotas and the positions of each one of these players, also whether a compromise can be reached on the matter.
Well, so the problem stems from the Dayton system. So under that system, you have a presidency made up of 3 members, one from each of the constituent nations. So one a Serb elected from Republika Srpska and a Croat and a Bosniak elected from the Federation. So the Bosnian Croat nationalists were frustrated because they didn't get their own entity, and this is linked to the failures in their war against the Bosniaks in 1993. When essentially the Bosnian Croat separatists were essentially defeated, and they were kind of rescued by American diplomacy with the Washington Agreement. But they didn't get their entity, which they declared in 1993, and they then had to dismantle it. So there's this kind of a frustration there. But they thought at least they would have his guaranteed position through the HDZ, a guaranteed member of the presidency, as the principal Bosnian Croat nationalist party, the party which has most Bosnian Croat votes. They would always have this man on the presidency. But what you've had in recent years is that this non-nationalist Croat, Željko Komšić, has been able to win the election to the Croat member of the presidency thanks to getting votes from both Croats and Bosniaks and presumably others as well. So essentially, this has been a kind of a defeat for Bosnian Croat nationalism in Bosnia, and means you have 2 anti-separatist voices on the presidency. So the HDZ would like to reform the law to essentially ensure that their man always wins the election. So to ensure that their nationalist party always has that seat on the presidency. Now, all parties which support Bosnian unity will be reluctant to do this because you already have one essentially separatist voice on the presidency, the Serb member. So then you would have 2 separatists out of 3 in the presidency, and that would be a big step towards the disintegration of the country. Conversely, of course, the Dodik will support the Bosnian Croat nationalists on this because he wants to disintegrate the country further. So he sees there's an alliance between these two nationalist movements, which have been going on since the 1990s. So there's kind of a deadlock there, and it's very difficult to see any basis of compromise, because if you were to grant these concessions to the HDZ and give them their seat in the presidency, it would encourage further separatist demands. It would be lead to further steps towards the break of the country. It's not like they would all become good, loyal Bosnians. They would then seek further concessions. So there's nothing really to be gained from appeasing them. These are nationalist movements, the Serb and Croat nationalist movements, which have arisen in aimed at destroying Bosnia Herzegovina. So I don't think there's any basis for a negotiation, and that is essentially the essence of Dayton. Essentially, you have the parties with diametrically opposed positions, and you need consensus for anything to change. We can't have consensus because they're totally opposed to each other. So unless you accept that someone's wish has to be overridden, you cannot have progress. So to restore a functioning Bosnia Herzegovina, you will need to override opposition from Serb or Croat nationalists. Other people will say that if you want to partition Bosnia, you could override Bosniak opposition. But essentially, you cannot have a compromise agreement. It doesn't work. You cannot have consensus because people want different things.
Well, I mean, what if they really boycott the elections? What's going to happen?
Bosnia will continue down its dysfunctional path. Things will not get any better. But essentially, that is inherent in the system. So in a sense, the system produces dysfunction, so this will be yet another manifestation of that dysfunction. It won't fundamentally change anything.
And also, I mean, in the country, we don't have only Bosnian Croats, Bosniaks, and Bosnian Serbs living. We have Jews and Roma, and this is linked to this. I mean, how does this, like this electoral reform play into this?
Well, it's a deeply racist system. It's a system which actually says that unless you are an ethnic Serb, Croat, or Bosniak, you cannot become a member of the presidency. If you're a Jew, you cannot become, or Roma, you cannot become a member of the Bosnian presidency. It's straightforward racism, which is entrenched in the Dayton system. And the Sejdic-Finci decision has shown that it's not in keeping with European values to have a constitution in the heart of Europe which is founded upon racism and discrimination. So that's another thing which the nationalists don't really address. That fundamentally they purely view Bosnia Herzegovina as a union of three constituent peoples, but not everyone is a member of those three constituent peoples. Not all Bosnian citizens are, and some Bosnians, perhaps many, fundamentally do not primarily identify themselves just as Bosniaks or Serbs or Croats, but also identify themselves as Bosnian Herzegovinians. So you have these non-nationalist Serbs and Croats who have always been there and don't accept these ethnic divisions as being paramount. So these acceptance of this principle of forcing everyone in Bosnia essentially to become one of these constituent nations is just not in keeping with European values. It's not something which Europe can endorse.
And Hikmet, we already mentioned that the country has actually been in a state of crisis since last July, when Bosnian Serb politicians began to boycott state-level institutions as an act of protest after the outgoing High Representative issued a ban on genocide denial. And also we again talked about earlier this month, we have seen Bosnian Serbs celebrating Statehood Day, which is banned by the country's constitutional court. Why are these acts significant? And given this situation, do you think a reconciliation is possible at all?
Yeah, so basically, just to give a short context on the law for criminalizing genocide denial and distortion, the law was firstly introduced in the Bosnian Parliament in 2008. So since 2008, that law was not able to pass through the Bosnian Parliament at all, mainly due to the veto by Bosnian Serb parliamentary MPs and also in some cases Bosnian Croat MPs. So after so many years of this unsuccessful attempt, the High Representative enforced this law because the amount of genocide denial and basically celebration of war crimes came to that extent that it was unbearable. So that was a direct reaction from the outgoing High Representative. And we at this point are, I think, we have passed that point of reconciliation that we could have had 10 years ago, basically. Because right now what we have is genocide denial and hate speech and triumphalism coming from state-sponsored institutions. So, 15 years ago, this kind of, Srebrenica genocide denial was on the margins of society. People who believe that the earth is flat also believe that there was no genocide in Srebrenica. Right now, what we have is state institutions. For example, the Ministry of Defense of Serbia publishing reports on genocide denial. You have the Serbian Orthodox Church doing this. You have academic institutions doing this, and this has become part of a policy, of a strategy of not only the Bosnian Serb Republic, but also of Serbia. And what we have also seen is that Srebrenica genocide denial has become a tool also in other regions, such as in other countries, such as, for example, Montenegro. And that was an interesting case in which, for example, the Minister for Human Rights and Minorities was on the record for genocide denial in Montenegro. And this kind of genocide denial actually is in place only to enforce and to provocate Bosniak civilians living in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Sanjak, in Kosovo, in Macedonia, in Bosnia, and so on. That's the sole aim of this genocide denial. So I'm currently in a very pessimistic mode, especially in this year, and I think that we have, talking about reconciliation this year, we just have to hope that we won't have to, find more mass graves from in this year, because the situation has been going and escalating in this extent. I believe that some sort of coordinated violence and conflict will definitely take place in several months.
Also, I mean, when we look at the Statehood Day celebrations, we've seen a Syrian prime minister there and some far-right leaders and giving speeches and everything. And this, I think it pretty much, as you mentioned, worsens the situation, isn't it?
Yeah, and also a convicted war criminal. So a person who took part in the Srebrenica genocide was standing next to Dodik and next to the French far-right politicians from Le Pen's party. So you have this nexus in the Bosnian Serb establishment of these different, war criminals, paramilitaries, Russian night wolves. You had the Russian night wolves, basically Putin's paramilitary, parading in Banja Luka a few weeks ago, and that didn't cause any sort of reaction from anybody anywhere. And you don't need to have the whole entire Russian army coming to Bosnia. You just need to have one small unit of Wagner forces, and that would be enough to create chaos in this region. And that's something I think that Western countries are slowly becoming aware of.
Yeah. So, Nafisa, there is a new generation of Bosnians who did not live through the horrors of the war we've been speaking of, but they're living in this constant state of crisis that can be seen in almost all the areas, from politics to economy. How do you think the Bosnian youth see the future of themselves and their country, and how does this, this ethnic divisions, do they have a role in their day-to-day lives? How do they impact?
Well, the Bosnian youth, unfortunately, they don't see themselves, their futures in the country. The United Nations, they did one report 2 months ago. They interviewed around 5,000 Bosnian youth. Half of them said they would leave the country, and half of that number said they would leave the country permanently. So this is the reality that we live in, and unfortunately, like Hikmet, I would like to be more positive, but I am not, especially not after all the celebrations and support that Dodik got for the 9th of January. So practically Bosnian youth, not just Bosnia, but I think in general, the problem of the Balkans is brain drain is something that's very common. But as of recently, it's getting even worse. Also, 1/3 of youth in Republika Srpska has left the entity. So it's not better in any part of Bosnia. So this is the current atmosphere. They don't trust their governments. They don't believe in the state institutions. They think their country is corrupt. This is all in that report. They think even despite having an education, they can't achieve what they want, which is decent life. So they're trying to leave and most probably never return. So this is the reality that we live currently in Bosnia. And me myself also left my country 5 years ago. I still haven't returned. And this is something that I think is our biggest problem. Of course, we first need to solve the current crisis that we have, but we need to find a way on how to stop these people from leaving. But as myself, there's no other option than to leave if you come to the point where, despite all your hard work, you are constantly faced with corruption in state institutions. You just lose your trust and you become even more pessimistic. So that's the latest report from the UN that says about the Bosnian youth, and I can assure you that the latest moves that we've seen from the US and the EU didn't help. They completely lost trust that someone will come in and help solve this. And unfortunately, yes, it would be great if we could solve our own problems, but the Dayton Agreement that we signed in 1995 left us no choice but to live with this constitution. And I agree with Marco that is completely against any human rights. But it is something that it was imposed on us. And instead of living as citizens of Bosnia, we have to live as these separate ethnicities, which is obviously not leading us anywhere. It's completely against any kind of EU human rights law. So that's the perspective of the Bosnian youth at the moment, unfortunately.
So we talked a lot about Dayton, but my final question, I'm sure you're all going to touch Dayton again, is going to be for all of you. Given the current situation in Bosnia, the country seems to be caught between a frozen conflict and a breakup of the country. What could be a way forward? And I'll start with Nafisa first.
What could be the way forward? Well, that's a $1 million question, isn't it? As a someone who is Bosniak, who has 6 years old when the war started, and spent a couple of years as a refugee in the 90s, and witnessed all these things that were happening around the world, and unfortunately not in my country. I feel my country is stuck somewhere in the 90s, and unfortunately, every time we have a new crisis, I'm hoping that we will have some kind of new solution that I don't see at the moment. Is that some kind of change in our constitution in Dayton? Most probably. How to do that, I'm not sure. So I think it's a very difficult question at this moment, because obviously not even the EU or the US or even our own leaders know how to solve this. So what I can say is that I believe that my country deserves better, that we do need to change this thing that we had to sign just to stop the bloodshed. But someone needs to definitely step in my opinion. And I think it needs to be the EU. Bosnia is still in the heart of the EU. And for the EU's future, it's crucial to maintain Bosnia's stability and the region's stability. The genocide denial law sparked not just the crisis in Bosnia, it sparked the crisis in Montenegro, as Hikmet mentioned. So it just shows how this issue is sensitive. So to move forward, first, we need to all agree on the facts and the narrative. I think that would be the first step towards a better future, at least to have this narrative of what actually took place, to have those court case, the war criminals behind bars, to have people who are constantly denying genocide punished in some way. We've seen that law that INSCO imposed. Again, we've seen genocide denial in Banja Luka. What does that mean? Are they going to be punished? What is the next step? So these are, I think, the questions that we need to solve first, and then we maybe we can think about a better future and stopping these people from leaving permanently from the Balkans.
Mm-hmm. And Marco, what would be your take on this?
Yes, I agree with all of that. I mean, the thing is, I think we have to see this, Europeans and Americans have to see this as a crisis that's very dangerous for stability, danger of war, danger of regional instability and conflagration, and they need to take radical action to put an end to this crisis. And I think, given that Dodik has announced RS's secession from Bosnian state institutions, he's rejected the OHR, we can legitimately say that he has essentially repudiated the Dayton Agreement. He's broken the Dayton Agreement, and there is no longer any reason to respect any kind of Serb veto on constitutional reform. So what you need to do, I think, is for the United States, Britain, other friends of Bosnia in the EU to act together with the Bosnian presidency members who support Bosnia and Herzegovina, two of them, to bring about a new constitutional order, to get rid of the Dayton system, to impose a new constitutional order that will recreate a functional Bosnian state with a functional central authority, and simply not accept any kind of Serb nationalist or pro-nationalist veto on that. You can do that, or you can accept this crisis is going to go on indefinitely.
And finally, Hikmet, it would be really hard to speak as the final speaker, but the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, so basically, I agree with everything that Marco and Nafisa already said. And I mean, I would just like to add a few more concrete things currently in this situation. I think, in my opinion, the main, most important thing to do right now is for NATO to open a base in Brčko, because Brčko is the most important area in Bosnia and Herzegovina right now. That is one thing, and also to increase NATO presence in the federation and to reopen the former American airbase Eagle in Tuzla. And in this way, we would be able to, finally put a stop to Russian mingling in Bosnia, and basically that would be a way for NATO to say, this is our territory, this is where we are supposed to be, and that's it. And I just hope that will happen soon, because otherwise we're going to have a Ukrainian scenario or a Syrian scenario in Bosnia.
Thank you very much to you all, and also to our audience who were with us tonight, for joining TRT World's digital debates. And hopefully we'll meet to discuss more positive developments on Bosnia next time. Thank you very much again.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.